I think the second theme really relates to maintenance, size, rental prices. Essentially, Minister Edwin Tong's reply or ministerial statement. I understand Mr. Seah Yao Chuan had a question that has already been answered. I understand that Mr. Leon Pereira had a third question that I asked for him to postpone to this phase of the debate. I propose that we look at ending this at about 5:30. So can I ask members to keep their clarifications short? Thank you. Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try and keep it very short. So for Minister Tong, firstly, the methodology of direct negotiated rental versus open bidding system. If I understand the Minister correctly, direct negotiated rental is taken in weak market conditions, and that was why for 26 and 31 Ridout, that methodology was used. I have seen information from some media outlets which may or may not be accurate, which is why I'm putting the question here, that at the relevant time, 2018, 2019, most of the other properties on Ridout were actually rented out. So on what basis was the determination made that market conditions were weak such that you had to resort to direct negotiated rental as opposed to an open bidding system? First one. The second one is really just, I'm trying to reconcile what has been said in the report about how certain properties, black and white bungalows, are not listed on the SPIO in a down cycle because you don't want too much transparency, which may deter bidders. They can see a lot of vacant properties. And I quoted something from the Straits Times earlier about that policy. I can understand that policy intent, but I'm just struggling to reconcile that with this notion that anyone can go to SLA and just get a full listing of those properties. So how do those two things gel together? I mean, if someone can go to SLA and get a full listing of properties, why are some properties not listed on the SPIO? And lastly, if I could just finish off the very quick response to what DPMTO said in response to me. I was not suggesting that CPIB should not be involved and AGO should handle it instead. I think CPIB has an important role to play to look at Prevention of Corruption Act offences, which they've done. I was suggesting that the determination of consistency of the Ministerial Code of Conduct be done by an independent organization. It could be the AGO, it could be a judge or a retired judge or someone else to put that imprimatur of independence. I wasn't suggesting either or. You may disagree with that. I think SMTO probably does disagree, but that was what I was putting forward to clarify.
Just 2 points before I hand over to my colleague. First of all, exactly, I clarified that I didn't say anybody. I said any credible prospect. So it's not just anybody, but any credible prospect, and I explained that. Secondly, this government takes responsibility over the code of conduct. We don't outsource it to someone else. We believe that we should take responsibility for the code of conduct and the conduct of our ministers. And so we take responsibility for that. You can't outsource this. So those are the 2 points I want to make.
Minister Edwin Tong.
So to Mr. Pereira's first question on market conditions. The market conditions are set out in, well, first you can see the table that I circulated earlier. I think that tells you what the rental index was for URA as a whole. And in addition, specifically on Ridout, you'll see from SMTO's report, one of the annexes, that at the material time, it was at 71%. So I think that answers your first question. On your second question, you said that the black and whites were not put on SPIO because we don't want too much transparency. I would say please don't put words in my mouth or put it in my speech, which was not the case. That's not the reason why it's not on SPIO. And I think if you've heard the subsequent debate that we've had on this, on the list, property, how it's accessed and so on, there's nothing confidential about this. There's no secret list of properties that only certain people can rent. Go back to first principles. SLA is the landlord. And I told you at my speech that we want to maximize occupancy. We want these properties to be rented. What's the best way in which they can be rented? In an upmarket, you want to make sure that it's as exposed as possible, because there's more demand than there is supply. In a down market, it's the contrary, but not for lack of transparency reasons, as you try to suggest. It's because you don't want to have yourselves have each property bid against itself, to have more supply than demand exhibited on all the portals. So what's being done in those situations is for some properties at the discretion of the MA to be listed on the SPIO. Other properties might well find their way on other property portals like Property Guru and so on. And the managing agent and each of their real estate agents in their network would in fact have the full list of all the assets that are available for renting. All the black and whites, in this case, available for renting, would be something known by the managing agent. And they would want that advertised as much as they can through their networks. And so the purpose of not listing it on SPIO is not for transparency reasons, Mr. Pereira. It is to ensure that the right strategy is adopted, to ensure that we market in the right way that coheres with the dynamics and movements of the market at the relevant time.
Mr. Murali Pillai.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I have two questions. The first is to the Honourable Senior Minister, Mr. Teo. Given the fact that he was installed as the head of the chain of command in relation to the dealings pertaining to 26 Ridout Road, now that we have established the facts, if we were to turn the clock back, are there any facts that you would have expected to be raised to your attention? So I'm not seeking an elaborate answer, a brief answer on that would suffice. My next question is to the Honourable Minister Shanmugam. Given the sheer size of the property at 26 Ridout Road, there have been some comments in the public about whether ministers living in such private properties have a connection with the people and would be able to relate to the people. And also whether such acts kind of engenders a picture of inequality in Singapore. I wonder whether the Honourable Minister has a response to that. Thank you.
SM Teo.
On Mr. Murali's first question, I think that the Minister Shan in this particular case, handled himself and recused himself properly. So I have no difficulty with what he did.
Minister Shan.
So Mr. Pillai has asked two questions. One about inequality and the other about empathy. I think it goes back to the point that Mr. Singh referred to as optics as well. It's tied to that. With your leave, sir, I would like to take some time in answering this question because this is quite important.
Yes.
So I seek your indulgence. Yes.
We can go past 5:30 if needed. Not for your response. I mean for this debate. These clarifications rather. There's no debate. Please proceed, Minister.
Might take a fair bit of time, but anyway. So, I mean, I understand the question. It's many Singaporeans face challenges in today's economic climate, rising prices for many things, high inflation. So inequality is one of the biggest issues we are grappling with, not just here in Singapore, but the world over. And how we deal with it and the values that inform our approach are important. I often speak about inequality when I speak outside to audiences because it is a critical issue for Singapore and also because it is seared into me because I've gone through it myself, seen it firsthand. So it's not just an academic exercise for me. I grew up in rental housing. I stayed in Bukit Ho Swee as a young boy. Then as a teenager, I lived in a 3-room flat in Block 3, Ghim Moh. I still remember the address. About 20 years later, as a senior counsel, I owned a GCB in Astrid Hill. And prior to that, I owned a house in Ui Tiong Hiam Park, also very nearby, though I never lived in that house. The distance between Block 3, Ghim Moh and Astrid is only about 1 kilometer. It's a short walking distance. But the psychological and financial distance between Ghim Moh and Astrid or Ui Tiong Hiam is oceans wide. As an undergraduate, when I lived in Ghim Moh, I used to cross the old Bukit Timah railway line, walk up East Sussex Lane to the bus stop along Holland Road to take a bus to law school. 20 years later, I would drive along Holland Road. At the same bus stop, instead of walking up the left, I make a right turn into Coronation Road West to go into Queen Astrid Park, to go to my house there. I think a lot about inequality and the gap, not least because I have straddled the gap and have lived at both extremes, rental and GCB. So for my part, the circumstances I grew up with are seared into me. And when you have gone through the experiences I have, you never forget them, regardless of how successful you become. So how should you deal with inequality? You don't deal with inequality by preventing poor kids from doing well. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew set up a system that allowed a poor Indian kid to become a successful lawyer, to do well. You tackle inequality by providing for social mobility, by helping people to move up. You do this, for example, by providing good support, opportunities, help everyone to move up, and redistributing income from those who have succeeded to the poor or less well off through taxes. You can tax the rich more and redistribute while making sure to keep the system fair. If you tax too much, the wealthy will leave. If you don't tax enough, it won't be a fair system. So you have to get it just right. And in Singapore, the top 10% of personal income taxpayers account for, I believe, 80% of our total income tax revenue, personal income tax revenue. And those at the lower 20% receive about $4 in benefits for every tax dollar they pay. So in Singapore, those who are wealthier must understand Singapore is a small place. We sink or swim together. And they need to contribute, pay more taxes. We have to make sure that those who are less well off are properly taken care of, and there is social mobility and opportunity. Personally, based just on the 2-3 years income between 2005 and 2007, before I became a minister, I probably paid more than $2 million in taxes. And rightfully so. A famous American jurist, Oliver Wendell Holmes, once said, "Taxes are the price we pay for civilization." In my case, all I have, I got from Singapore. It's only right for me to give back. Dealing with inequality is always a work in progress. And how can we continue to find ways to bring about greater equality? We must encourage those who have more, who have achieved more, to come forward and contribute their time and talent and resources to help make a stronger society. We need people to step forward, help fellow Singaporeans, including in public service. So if you look at Mr. Lee's approach, since the start, he brought in people who were doing well outside and those who had the heart to serve. Some were independently very wealthy, but he persuaded them to give up their careers in the private sector to come in to serve Singapore. They, together with Mr. Lee, did more than most to make Singapore a more equal society. Of course, if there are other good workable suggestions on how we can do better, that will be good. But we shouldn't penalize people who do well. And sir, on Mr. Pilay's second question on empathy, if you live in such a place, how can you have empathy? I just spoke about Mr. Lee's approach. Whether you should serve or not should depend on your heart. Do you want to help serve, make lives of Singaporeans better? Mr. Lee brought in people as ministers and MPs regardless of their background, and didn't matter if they were rich or poor, from trade unionists like Mr. Mahmud Awang, from the Singapore Traction Company Employees Union, Mr. Ho Si Beng from Printers Union, to highly successful businessmen and professionals like Mr. Lim Kim San and Mr. Eddie Barker. For example, Mr. Lim Kim San, he was a shrewd, successful businessman when Mr. Lee brought him into public service. Mr. Lee said he helped change the fortunes of Singapore as HDB chairman. He then served as minister in various ministries, including finance, defense, national development, where he was also responsible for building HDB flats. He lived in a very large bungalow in Dalby Road. Staying there and his wealth didn't prevent him from feeling the plight of Singaporeans who had no homes to live in and doing his utmost to solve their problems by building HDB homes for them. Others too. Mr. Barker is the minister who drafted the separation agreement. He stayed in Queen Astrid Park. Should Mr. Lee have said to him, Eddie, you are a successful lawyer living in Queen Astrid Park, you can't serve Singapore? Dr. Goh Keng Swee stayed in a very large black and white bungalow at Goodwood Hill. He was DPM, key architect of modern Singapore, economy, defense, education, across the board. Mr. Hon Sui Sen, he served as finance minister, chairman EDB, president of DBS. He also rented a black and white at Malcolm Road. Or I should add, at that time, it was among the benefits that senior officials could rent houses reserved for them. When we moved to a clean wage policy, these black and whites and other state-owned properties were made available to anyone, and the rentals were determined by the market. But they remain the same type of black and white houses that Minister Vivian and I are staying in, not any more prestigious or less prestigious then or now, and some, of course, quite run down as compared to modern GCBs. So it becomes a matter of personal preference. Now, I should add, I'm not in any way seeking to compare myself or other current ministers with the ministers I have mentioned. Point I'm making is a person's ability to serve should not depend on where he lives or how poor or rich he is. And what about myself? I don't believe the homes I lived in have affected my ability to serve and empathize. I was doing well in my career as a lawyer while I was serving as a backbench MP for more than 20 years before I became a minister. As I explained, this was how I was able to buy my family home and pay the rental for Ridout. I became an MP in September 1988 when I was 29. At that time, I was a few months away from becoming a partner. I knew it would be very challenging to manage my career and be an MP at the same time. But I agreed to stand for elections in 1988, become an MP, and do what I can to make Singapore a better place. Every hardworking MP will know the requirements of being an MP in terms of time, energy, are considerable. From the beginning of my journey as an MP, I found it demanding, but I also found it inspiring. Demanding because my legal career required my full attention, but it was inspiring because I was doing what I could to forge a community in Chong Pang. I enjoyed interacting with my residents. I drew meaning and purpose from serving my residents. When I came into politics in 1988, most Chong Pang residents were generally less well off. Many were like my parents who had to work tirelessly to provide the best for their children. They are good, hardworking people. They want a better life. They want their children to do better. And I want to be there to help them to do so. So although it was challenging to juggle between being an MP and my legal career, I carried on. Then in 2008, I was asked by Prime Minister to become a minister because Prof. Jayakumar, who had been law minister for 20 years by then, was stepping down. I was 48 at the peak of my career. It would have been much easier for me to continue being a full-time lawyer than to join cabinet. I did also seriously think about the cutback in income. It was going to be very significant. I had to assess what it would mean for me, my family, and assess that against what I could contribute by serving Singaporeans as a minister. I asked myself on my last day on earth, this is a question I ask frequently, when I reflect back on my life, what would I have wanted to have done with my life? Spend all my time making more money, or also spend some time doing some good work for the community and others, and perhaps some good for the country. Many things that people spend time on will not seem worthwhile to have done in the rearview mirror when your life is about to end. So having twice or three times more money would not make me twice or three times more happy or fulfilled. So I accepted PM's invitation, agreed to enter full-time politics as a minister. It was and continues to be an honor and a privilege to serve Singaporeans and Singapore. As I said, all I have, I got from Singapore. It was Singapore's system, the system that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Goh Keng Swee and their team set up to provide stability, good standards of living, good schools, and opportunities that allowed me and so many others to achieve what we have, despite where we started, and in spite of race, language, or religion. So I was fortunate to have been born in Singapore, and I want to help make policies to make sure other Singaporeans have the opportunities that I did. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not suggesting that I made a special sacrifice in taking a pay cut or moving from my family home. It wasn't a sacrifice. It is a privilege to serve Singapore, Singaporeans. I've done this now for 35 years, 20 years as a backbencher and 15 as a minister. I've spent more than half my life in Parliament and more than half my life with Chong Pang. I do not hide what I earned as a lawyer. It's public knowledge. My residents judge me by my heart and my commitment to serve, not by how much I earn and where I live. They know I am there for them, that I'm there to help. I've lived in a HDB flat, rental flat, 3-room flat, 5-room flat, condominium, semi-detached, bungalows, GCBs, before I moved to Ridout. My empathy did not increasingly decrease as my houses got larger or as I made more money. Over the years, and no one raised any issue of my empathy or my ability to serve, in the 10 years I was living in my GCB in Astrid Hill. Is the empathy affected? Does it get more affected when you move from a GCB that you own to a black and white that you rent? Is that the way we are going to judge politicians? I hope members will seek to make Singaporeans and everyone understand what is involved, because we shouldn't start judging people on the basis of where they live or how successful they were in the private sector, and then say, you're too successful, you cannot come in to serve. I think that will be a wrong principle. And it's contrary to everything that made Singapore successful in the first generation. I have seen generations of Chong Pang residents. Some have moved out into bigger residences, some have received scholarships to study overseas, some have moved back to stay in new developments in Nee Soon, so that they could be near to take care of their aging parents. These are gratifying reminders that our system works well. We have good social infrastructure to uplift those who can excel, support the vulnerable, make every town a caring and livable home. It has been a deeply fulfilling journey for me these 35 years. The heart is the same. The commitment is the same from the time when I started when I was 29. And I don't think where I stay or have stayed has affected whether I've been able to serve. And now I've chosen to live in a bungalow in Ridout. As I said, the money that I made in my previous job as a lawyer is essentially paying for the rental. And it doesn't change my empathy any bit from when I was living in the GCB or the previous houses. So in summary, in answer to the clarification question, I was doing well in my profession. I was asked to come forward and serve. I could have said no and carried on with my legal career. But I felt that if the Prime Minister wanted me on his team, I had something to contribute. I could make a bigger contribution to Singapore in that way. So I did. It is for others to decide if I have measured up as a minister. But in good conscience, I can say I have put my heart and soul into it and carried out my duties to the best of my ability. Thank you, sir.
Associate Professor James Lim.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. So 2 clarifications about the land implications. I understand that from the Minister Tong that what is being priced in terms of square foot of built-up area is in fact consistent with market pricing as well as SLA practice. That said, I believe that what many Singaporeans are concerned about is this notion that when you speak of the market, there's one type of market, one class of rentals for heritage buildings with bundled land where the market valuation for land is different. And there's another market, a market where if you live in the HDB, then it's land pricing, where otherwise you would be raiding the reserves. So I'm wondering if, in light of this, he wishes to comment if the SLA's anomalous approach to valuing land for black and whites, if that he will accept that there are at least different methodologies for the pricing of land, and if so, then will the chief valuer accept the possibility of differential land pricing as well for HDB? My second question has to do with the 172,000 amount that was amortized to 2,000. Now, this is a little bit technical for 26 Ridout. Based on my calculations, what I found was that that would amount to, assuming a reasonable rate of interest, something in the order of 3,000 to 4,000 rather than the 2,000. So I'm wondering if some clarification could be offered on that front.
Minister Edwin Tong.
I keep making this point about the market, and maybe I'll say that again. You've got to look at the market, and I mentioned in my speech that we look at comparables. You can't take a HDB and try and say what is the value of a black and white property for rental based on the same principles. Just as you can't take a terrace house or a condominium and apply that as a comparable to what you do when you want to value for rental and find the right valuation for a black and white property as we see here. So it's got to be comparable in the sense that land size, age of the property, condition of the property. You look at the comparables and then maybe you make adjustments for outliers and for the specific condition and location of this particular property. And that has been the methodology that has been used. I took some care to explain it. But now you, along with others, question that again, and now you use the word anomalous. It is not anomalous. It is market practice. And the tables that I keep going back to, and I would encourage you to please have a look at it, tells you that right across Singapore, across all different locations where black and whites are obtained or can be found, for which 87% of them are managed by external professional managing agents who have their own valuation team, they assess based on market price and market methodology. Your point about looking at a rate on reserves, which, I mean, you make obviously to try and make the point that there is a distinction and that you're trying to second guess that distinction and perhaps suggest that there is some inequality and perhaps unfair treatment. But the member will know that you've got to look at it as a different comparable. First of all, when you're valuing land for the purposes of HDB, you're looking at the question of selling HDB property with a leasehold interest of 99 years. It's a very different proposition from valuing the appropriate rental to be collected from a heritage black and white property like this. So, yes, there are different parameters, different baskets, but that's because the intrinsic nature of the property in question calls for this difference. Your second question, could you please repeat it?
Thank you. So my second question has to do with there was a land clearance cost of $172,000, and I believe that that was amortized to something in the order of $2,000 a month. And at least based on my independent calculations for the extended rental period of 4 years, it comes up to something closer to $4,000 rather than $2,000. So I'm wondering what kind of assumptions SLA applied.
Can I ask the member, what do you mean by 4 years?
Because as far as I understand it, the rental was extended by a 3+2, and at the time that the land clearance was implemented.
I think you might have confused the facts, Mr. Lim. The rental at 26 was granted on the basis of a 3+3+3. So what was done was to take the land cost and amortize it with an imputed interest across a 9-year period, and that's where you get to $2,000. So I hope that clarifies. It's not 4 years.
Why?
Deputy Speaker, I would like to ask Minister Edwin Tong the following questions, 2 questions. One is, can he give us examples of black and white bungalow tenants whom SLA had offered the following terms: preparatory work before they move into the unit of hundreds over thousands. SLA spent hundreds over thousands on a tenant before he moved into the unit. And this, in the case of 26 and 31, Ridout Road, the amount spent for preparatory works amounts to 2.2 years of their rental, respectively. So is this kind of term SLA will give to other tenants? Secondly, allow the tenant to construct a swimming pool. Do they do that all the time? 3, cut down trees that are with girths as more than a meter. Okay, and at the same time, offer some help in applying to cut the trees. Okay, and then, like in the case of 26 Ridout Road, they were given additional land. Although the ministers have explained that this land is actually of no value. But I think it's very difficult to convince Singaporeans who are so obsessed with land. Senior Minister Teo quote the example of Delvey Estate, that the Delvey Estate tenant was willing to, for SL to take back the land. And that means reduce his size of his unit. Then why, in the case of 26 Ridout Road, SLA actually imposed a $2,000 more on the rental for the extra land? I mean, the logic still doesn't really settle in very well. Okay, so do the SLA offer this kind of deal to other tenants? And finally, in the case of 31 Ridout Road, the initial rent was actually 22% below the average rent shown to us by this table. Right? Yeah, it's from your table, chart 2, SMTO. The average rent is 29.6. 31 Ridout Road is 23.05. So that is 22% discount. And on top of that, you are spending $570,000 to upgrade number 31 Ridout Road. So what is the justification? Sorry? 22%, right? And on top of that, you spend $570,000 to upgrade number 31 Ridout Road. And then you still charge at a 22% discount to the market. Is this kind of deal SLA give to other people? There's still a lot more questions I'm going to ask. Deputy Speaker, I think the debate is not going to end at 5:45. Thank you.
Mr. Leong, I think the chair decides at what time the clarifications end. In fact, this is not a debate.
Point of order, sir. This is an important issue. All Singaporeans are watching this debate.
Mr. Leong, I don't disagree with you that this is a matter of public importance.
Yes.
And in fact, Standing Order 23 makes specific reference that ministerial statements be made on matters of public importance.
Yes.
But the second sentence in Standing Order 23 also states there shall be no debate. Clarifications can be asked. So there is no debate whether under Standing Order 23 or Standing Order 25, which is a personal explanation. So the chair will decide when clarifications end.
Yes, what I urge the chair, Deputy Speaker, sir, is to be mindful that the topic has not been properly, completely clarified. When it's not completely clarified, please don't end the session. Thank you.
Mr. Leong, I think the response to you is that Mr. Leong, I invite you to kindly take your seat. We've been debating, we've had 4 ministerial statements from 12:30 p.m. It is now 5:30 p.m. That's, 5 hours worth of toing and froing. And I think the House has ventilated a lot of issues. And I will allow about 3 or 4 more clarifications from members, and then we'll proceed to end the ministerial statements. It is not for a member to dictate to the chair when business should end or start. I hope you can agree with me on that. Do we have agreement on that, Mr. Leong? Thank you. Do we have agreement on that, Mr. Leong? Yes. Thank you. Mr. Tong?
Thank you, sir. Sir, the preparatory works that Mr. Leong speaks about, I thought I did spend a fair bit of my speech explaining it. But let me just recap. These are conservation properties, and so there's a need to upkeep them, maintain them, and based on conservation guidelines. And there's a requirement on SLA as the owner and landlord of these properties to ensure that not just are they managed from a tenantability perspective, but also that we meet, cohere with, match up to conservation guidelines and how we maintain the property. Now, let's be clear that these obligations to maintain them based on conservation guidelines are on SLA, whether there's a tenant or otherwise. So these are expenditures that have to be incurred to maintain the property. I spent some time detailing what are some of the elements that we have to take into account when we maintain the property. And that's irrespective of whether there's a tenant. But we try to do it at a time when there's going to be a confirmed tenancy, so that the income stream received from the monthly rentals can go towards paying off the cost of the maintenance. And that's what happened in this case, both 26 and 31. And Mr. Leong will be aware that we've had several examples of this talked about in the media a few days ago. Those are all examples of properties, heritage properties, where significant expenditure was needed for the reasons I've outlined. I won't go into it again, and which we had done over and above what you've seen in 26 and 31 Ridout. In terms of the period of time at which number of months or years that it takes to recover back, as I said, the starting point is, even if there's no tenant, you would still have to incur these expenses to upkeep, to maintain. The amount of time we take to recover this is a factor to assess and judge whether we should proceed with this particular set of works at this time or otherwise, or maybe we can scale down or scale back if there's no tenant. But otherwise, it's taken in the round and assessed together. And if you take Ridout as an example, 2.2 years, you say. I think it's slightly less than that, but I'll take your 2.2 years. You have a tenant coming in, prepared to put in enhancements, like the swimming pool, which, by the way, we encourage. I think you heard me say earlier, we encourage. One of the ways in which SLA has been thinking of restructuring its tenancy framework is to try to encourage tenants to come in and put in CAPEX so that these properties can both be maintained as well as enhanced for subsequent purposes. So if the pool is there, put in at the cost of the tenant, at the expiry of the lease, that pool becomes the property of SLA. And that goes towards enhancing the value of the property for subsequent tenancies. So in fact, we encourage. And so when we do that, we look at the amount of time it takes for the recovery versus the improvements that this tenant is offering. This tenant is offering to come in with $400,000 or $500,000 worth of improvements, asking for 3 + 3 + 3 years. What's a reasonable commercial landlord going to do in that situation? In the context of the market that you've seen, I think I've sent round the chart so you can see that. And early on to Mr. Pereira's question, it's a 71% occupancy at that point in time. So these are factors that we take into consideration, and we assess based on each individual tenant, what are you offering, how are you enhancing, what do we have to do in terms of the works which we have to incur anyway, how can we bring it all together and ensure that we can maximize the returns. You mentioned the trees. The trees, look, if they're decayed, there's a report that the arborist puts up. We are, SLA, I think you used the words, why do we still go and help to take care of the trees? Well, we are the landlord, we own the property, and in the event that the tenant does not want to take ownership of the maintenance, then that falls on SLA. So of course we will be involved, of course we'll be interested. If a tree falls on a neighboring property, that's SLA's responsibility. So we take care to ensure that if the trees are found to be posing a safety concern, then we must work with the arborists, work with NParks, get the approval, and then get them removed. Those are where the girth is 1 meter or more. Your last point, I'm not sure I can comprehend what you're trying to ask me. It's got to do with number 26, as far as I could figure out. But 31, about the discount and so on to the average. But Mr. Leong, the guide rent for number 31 is determined on the market methodologies that I've outlined earlier. They were in fact determined in this case by the managing agent and the valuer, and they cohere with what the guide rent is, and the offer is not below the guide rent, which, by the way, is a key consideration for SLA. And so it's not below the guide rent. And when you compare it against the average, the way average works, you will have some above and some below. But is it within the guide rent? It is, and that's why SLA accepted the offer. I hope that clarifies your 4 points.
Ms. Denise Phua. Mr. Leong, don't worry, I'll come back to you. Ms. Denise Phua.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I appreciate that the Ridout review by SMTO and by agencies such as CPIB was made at the request of PM Lee, Prime Minister. And I also appreciate the fact that the request for full investigation was also made by Minister Shan and Minister Vivian themselves to clarify that the rental transactions are above board. Now, since some of the questions, parliamentary questions, were actually directed at the Prime Minister, and since the matter involves key members of the cabinet, of Prime Minister's cabinet, I would like to seek PM Lee's views on the matter so far, and also if he could share his views in the House.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I'm responding to Mr. Nispoa's question to give my take on this Ridout issue, which we've been debating now 5 hours. I think the focus of the debate has been on values: integrity, propriety, incorruptibility. Ministers in Singapore are paid a clean wage, realistic, competitive, but clean wage. They don't get perks. There's no official house to live in. You get a salary. It's for you to judge what you need it for your lives. Save it, give it away, spend it, put it in a house, travel, whatever. Therefore, where ministers decide to live, whether they want to rent, whether they want to buy, these are personal choices. And thus I see nothing wrong with ministers renting properties from SLA, or for that matter from a private landlord, provided it's properly done and all procedures are followed. Therefore, when I heard that two of my ministers, Shanmugam and Vivian Balakrishnan, had rented black and white bungalows at Ridout Road, my assessment, without going into it in depth, was that I did not believe there was wrongdoing involved. I had every confidence that my ministers and the SLA officials who dealt with them would have done the right things and handled the rentals properly. However, after SLA's statement on the 12th of May, the issue continued to attract public interest. And so when the two ministers asked me to conduct an investigation independent of their ministries, I decided that notwithstanding my confidence in them and in the system, it would be best for me to task CPIB to conduct a formal investigation and to establish definitively if there was any corruption or wrongdoing. Why CPIB? Because CPIB is independent. It has built up a strong reputation as an anti-corruption outfit. And it has the necessary legal powers guaranteed in the Constitution to carry out a thorough investigation. Everybody in Singapore knows what it means when CPIB invites you to lim kopi. And they can invite anybody, ministers, officials, businessmen, ordinary Singaporeans, whoever it is necessary for them to interview in order to establish the facts and the truth and whether there's culpability. I tasked CPIB to look into this on the 17th of May. I was then in Nairobi on an official visit to Kenya. CPIB's investigation went beyond the legal question of whether there was criminal conduct. It extended to broader issues like whether there was preferential treatment enjoyed by the ministers, whether any privileged information was disclosed to them, whether the ministers had abused their position in the process of the rentals. But I wanted these broader questions examined more thoroughly, because as PM, my duty is not just to be satisfied that legally there was no wrongdoing, but whether, quite apart from the law, there was any other kind of misconduct or impropriety. Therefore, after I returned from Africa on the 22nd of May, COVID notwithstanding, I tasked Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean to do a broader review of SLA's policies and processes to complement CPIB's investigation. SM Teo is my most senior minister in terms of years in cabinet and experience. I appointed him to show that I had every intention to maintain the government's and the PAP's long-standing, high and stringent standards of integrity and propriety. I wanted to put my most experienced, most qualified, for this purpose, most capable person on the job. I did not consider SM Teo to have been involved in the transaction, even though Minister Shanmugam had informed SM Teo of the arrangements he had made to recuse himself, including that then SMS Indrani Raja had been told to approach SM Teo if the matter had to go beyond her. Because no such issue arose and nothing was ever raised to SM Teo. He was the backstop and nothing reached him. It has been suggested, including today by some MPs, that even though SM Teo might not have been involved in the Ridout transactions, just because he's a minister, he is not sufficiently independent to conduct this investigation. I take a different view. When it comes to corruption and wrongdoing, crimes, we have an independent process, a CPIB investigation and referral to the Attorney General's chambers for an opinion. We are dealing with laws, with legality, and ultimately the courts are the arbiter of what is legal or illegal. But ethics and standards of propriety, those are the Prime Minister's responsibility. I have to set the standards of what's ethical, what's proper. I cannot outsource them. For example, to appoint an ethics advisor to tell me what is proper or not proper. I have to know what is proper or not. Otherwise, I shouldn't be here. An ethics advisor cannot be the one to decide and to advise the Prime Minister whether ministers acted with propriety or not. Some countries have tried this. You've read about some of them in the newspapers over the last few months. It has not always resulted in more ethical conduct or better government. In Singapore's context, the Prime Minister has to set the standards. He issues the rules of prudence to PAP MPs after every general election. I've done it now, I think, 4 times. He has to set the right personal example of proper conduct. He decides whether a minister has acted properly or not in accordance with the code and the rules. If he thinks so, he should say so. If he thinks not, he must say not. He cannot say, I have no view, I do not wish to influence my ministers and my MPs. Ultimately, the Prime Minister is still accountable and he has to justify his position here to Parliament and answer to Singaporeans at the ballot box. And that's how our system works. That's how it has been kept clean. That's my general approach and the attitude that I have taken in this case. When CPIB and Senior Minister Teo submitted their reports to me, I accepted all their conclusions and ordered the reports to be published and placed before the House before this meeting today, so that everybody can read them, digest them, and be ready to come here and have an informed discussion. These reports provide a good basis for Parliament to discuss the issue. Their conclusions are quite clear, as the ministerial statements you've heard earlier have explained from Senior Minister Teo and Minister Edwin Tong. CPIB found no corruption or wrongdoing, no preferential treatment, no disclosure of privileged information, no abuse of position for personal gain. The AGC confirmed this after reviewing the investigation papers. And the leader of the opposition paid CPIB and paid the government a compliment just now when he said, nobody is suggesting corruption on the part of the ministers. CPIB did find an imprecision in how SLA defined the guide rent for number 26 Ridout Road. Their report explained this, and CPIB established that this imprecision was not due to any ill intent on the part of the SLA officers, nor was there any evidence of any mala fide abuse of position in the valuation. The imprecision is embarrassing to SLA and the government, particularly as SLA had put out a statement earlier to say that the ministers both paid higher than the guide rents. But that cannot be helped. CPIB calls it as it is, with no regard to whom it might inconvenience or embarrass. SLA has acknowledged that CPIB's interpretation is the correct one, and they will review their practices and improve upon them. Senior Minister Teo's review, relying on CPIB's findings, confirmed the broader issues, that there was no conflict of interest or unfair advantage enjoyed, and that all rules and procedures had been complied with. And his report sets out the basis for his conclusions. These are not just his personal opinions, but conclusions based on documented facts, verified and laid out in the report. So it's very important that we've had this accounting in Parliament. Members have had full opportunity to ask questions and clarify doubts. The ministers, Minister Shanmugam and Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, have done nothing wrong, and they retain my full confidence. But this accounting in Parliament is not just to resolve the issue of the rentals on 2 black and white properties in Ridout Road, important as that is. It's also a demonstration of how the PAP is determined to uphold the standards which it has set itself from the beginning in 1959. This government has not and will never tolerate any compromise or departure from the stringent standards of honesty, integrity, and incorruptibility that Singaporeans expect of us. In this case, we've investigated it. The ministers have been cleared. In other cases which come up, we will investigate it, and whichever way the facts fall out, they will be taken to their logical conclusion. This is the foundation, not just for the people's trust in the PAP government, but for the integrity and good functioning of our political system. And this is my commitment and the PAP government's unwavering commitment to Singaporeans. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Just a question for the Prime Minister with regard to the scope of the CPIB investigation. Was CPIB tasked to look into the code of conduct of the ministers and whether the ministers acted in accordance to the code? Because the earlier explanation of the Prime Minister suggested that CPIB looked into the whole range of issues beyond legal issues. My understanding from the miscellaneous paper was CPIB was looking to see whether there was any whether a criminal or corruption offence could be disclosed.
Yeah, I have it. CPIB's instructions from me were to establish whether any corruption or criminal offence had been committed, criminal wrongdoing had been committed. You cannot do that without going into all the facts of the case, and in the process of going to the facts of the case, they came to conclusions on preferential treatment, on disclosure of privileged information, on abuse of position. And they put it into the report and in their letter to me, that they had found none of this. They went into it. And I think these are issues which are relevant to whether the ministers complied with the code of conduct or not. So I did not ask them to investigate the conduct, but they came to these conclusions, and because their main focus had been the more narrow one of the legal question of criminal offense, therefore I complemented the CPIB investigation with SM Teo's review, and he wrote on what the CPIB did. He did further fact-finding and establishment of the policies and of the backgrounds and of the overall way the system operated and SLA operated, and his conclusions are in the report, and they are consistent.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate you calling me again. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for that reply. Coming back to the gravamen of, I think, what a lot of the discussion was over the last at least 3.5 hours with regard to asking a civil servant for information. I think Senior Minister Teo has made his point that there was, quite frankly, nothing untoward about it because the nature of the information was as such. This, of course, upon reading the miscellaneous paper, is not apparent to the public. It is quite incongruous in the eyes of many for a minister to be asking a civil servant details which pertain to information for his personal use. I think this is the crux of the issue. And when people intersect it with the ministerial code of conduct and your letter of prudence, does the Prime Minister not agree that actually this is an issue that has been flagged out and that there is a better way to address a problem of a similar nature when it crops up?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think if you remember the history of this issue, the question of the minister instructing the civil servant was not public knowledge until we brought it out. The issue has been there since, I don't know, April, over a few months, and the outrageous allegations were being made that the ministers had enjoyed improper benefits and inside tracks and were getting a sweet deal, and all sorts of very grave innuendos were being stated. Nobody cared how he found out about the properties. Now that the report has come out and all those grave suspicions have been dispelled, you focus on this question and you ask, should he have asked the Deputy Secretary? My view is he could have done it a different way. He could have done it this way. He has given the House the reasons why he did it this way. I think those are cogent reasons, which I accept.
Mr. Murali Pillai.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, on a point of information, in relation to the Honourable Leader of Opposition's query as to whether CPIB looked at the Minister's Code of Conduct, I just would like to offer that in any corruption investigation, to establish corrupt intent, one looks at what are the guiding principles. Code of conduct would be very relevant to establish corrupt intent. And in fact, there's a two-point rule that has been established at law. One is whether there's been a breach of the code of conduct, and secondly, whether there's guilty knowledge that's associated with the action. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Mr. Edward Chia.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'd just like to turn it back to policy to Minister Edwin Tong and to ask if the existing policy on guide ride at the onset and upon renewal takes into consideration additional structures like swimming pools and car porch, because it brings additional utility, and not just per se a GFA, but additional utility. And in what way does this also differ from commercial properties? Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, if you're a tenant, we encourage the tenants to come and improve the facilities and enhancements made to the property. So all of these, eventually, when it comes to a fresh tenancy, will be taken into account. One of the rules that SLA internally looks at and has in mind is if it is the same tenant who made the investments, renewing it at the second +3 and the third +3, then you would take it all in a round. You will consider this, but you also consider the fact that this is the very tenant who put in the capex in the first place to bring about those enhancements. Because if you did not do that, and you simply, at every renewal in the 3+3+3, charged a higher rental because of what he has done, then no tenant would then eventually take up this, and it would work against SLA. So with that caveat, otherwise, the improvements, enhancements will be taken into account in subsequent renewals of tenancies.
Ms. Hazel Phua.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I would like to find out from Minister Edwin Tong, why is it that SLA choose, because it was mentioned in the report that demand for black and white bungalows is limited because it only has basic amenities. And I can quite see that the amount of renovation cost that's required to be spent on rental property can be a deal breaker for many. So why does SLA choose not to install modern amenities like what private landlords do to improve demand and rental rates? And secondly, I understand the rationale for the reason why 26 Ridout Road was not listed on SPIO, but with hindsight, when it is apparent that a minister is interested in renting the property, would it not have been better to have listed the property on SPIO? Thank you.
On your second point, it is the call of the managing agent. It's the managing agent's discretion, and whether it is the minister or some other person trying to rent, they take the same position. As you've heard SMTO explain earlier, there is no VIP treatment or VIP track, regardless of the identity or the profile of the tenant. If you meet the guide rent, you're able to clear the profile of the right tenant that we want. In particular, if you're able to offer more capex to enhance, that's a tenant profile that we want to seek. I also want to pick up, while I'm on that, on one of the questions you have filed for written answer, which is whether or not there is a record of which other ministers and public figures stay at these state properties. The point consistent with what I've said earlier is that SLA doesn't maintain a separate record. There's no list of which ministers, which members of parliament, which public figures are staying at state properties. On your first point about installing modern facilities, again, you've got to take it in the round. If you are able to cluster them and rejuvenate and maybe invite an external private sector party to work with you to placemake and to modernize, then yes, in those cases, it has been done, and we will continue on that. But obviously, you don't want to install and retrofit a property in a particular way, only for a tenant to want to do it in a different way. So for some of these, we maintain it as it is. We make the basic additions from time to time, but we also rely on the tenant who comes in, such as in these two examples, to retrofit and to enhance the property.
So Mr. Leong Wan Wai, I'm giving you some latitude, so ask all the questions that you have. Please, no preambles, just clarifications.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Okay, first of all, can I ask Minister Edwin Tong? Just now he didn't, I think his reply is not quite complete. Maybe I asked the questions not too well. What I was asking is that, did SLA offer the same kind of package? Did SLA offer the same kind of package to other tenants before? Okay, in the rental of the black and white bungalows, consisting of what I say just now, that before the tenant move in, it's coincided with the time when SLA have to refurbish the bungalow. So as a result, they spend hundreds of $1,000s to refurbish before the tenant move in. Secondly, is that there are other, now he said that everyone is encouraged to put in CAPEX. So, but in the past, do SLA actually allow tenants to put in swimming pools easily? Is it something that SLA really welcomed in the past? And finally, he didn't answer, and what I'm trying to say is that within the package, there is also preferential rental treatment for 31st Ridout Road. And he answered that it's not just the average, also the range of rental, but you look at chart 2, $23 per square meter is way, way below even the lowest rent in the Ridout Road vicinity. So how do you justify that? After spending $570,000 renovating 31st Ridout Road, and then you still offer a price of $23 per square meter. And so this is my question for Minister Edwin Tong. Finally, I have a question for the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, as I said just now, we believe in the integrity of our government led by you. And we are not against ministers living well, living in GCBs, like what Minister Shanmugam has tried to say that we are against that just now. We are not. But I don't think many would disagree that from this episode, there is a perception of an amount of conflict of interest and unfairness in the process of renting the 2 bungalows. Although there may not be, and we trust the investigation by CPIB and also SMTO, although there may not be an outright misconduct of any public servants. But the result is that there's this perception there. Okay? And the question I asked Minister Edwin Tong is exactly trying to drive at that. Why is the package so coincidentally favorable? That's one thing. Huh? It may be so coincidental. Okay. So as a result, I'd like to ask you one question, Prime Minister, is that from this episode, would you say that, would you commit that from now on, the code of conduct of the PAP government will be applied more stringently? Learning from this episode. You think that, you say that, no, this episode doesn't show any shortcoming or any in the application of the COC. This is a kind of standard we can expect from the PAP government. We'll take it as that. Thank you.
PM.
I thank Mr. Leong for clarifying that he's not against ministers living in GCBs. He just wants to play it up. Because having said that he has nothing against ministers living wherever they feel they wish to live, he then raises this alleged perception of conflict of interest and unfairness, when we have spent the last 5 hours explaining why there's no actual conflict of interest, why potential conflicts of interest have been cut off, and therefore there is no possibility of a reasonable perception arising of conflict of interest. And therefore, when he says, the PAP Code of Conduct, do I intend for it to be stringently applied? What he really means is, should I or should I not allow ministers to rent GCBs or to rent black and whites? My answer is, I do not object to ministers renting black and whites. They live within their salary, they live within their means. Some have come into office with means because they have had successful careers before. Some may have inherited wealth. Who knows? Some come in without much. They live with what they have. They comply with the laws. They do things properly. And most importantly, they continue to do their duties as a minister and to serve their constituents and to serve Singaporeans and to make a contribution on my team as an honest, capable. There's a phrase in the minister's swearing in text. In all things, to be a true and faithful minister. That's what we expect of all PAP ministers.
Mr. Leong, I answered all three questions previously. I'll try and answer them again. On your first one, I said yes. In fact, there are examples in the media of how we have spent this amount, more than 500,000, on the maintenance and refurbishment of other properties. I also mentioned that this is because there are conservation obligations, and that's why we appointed a consultant to advise us on what works needs to be done for each of them. Second, you asked about the swimming pool. Yes, if you would like to rent one and you want to put a pool in, we welcome that. Third, there is no preferential treatment. We go by the guide rent. The guide rent will assess the condition, the location, the comparables, and then make a judgment on what the appropriate rental is for that situation, for that property. And in this case, you say it's below the average, is because of the state of the condition of the property. It was poor condition, having been vacant for about 5 years or so. But that's a factor that the guide rent takes into account. But the point is, Minister Vivian met the guide rent, and that's why it was led to Minister Vivian.
Mr. Leong, could I invite you to just keep it to
Thank you.
two clarifications?
Thanks, sir. But Minister, your answer is not logical, right? 31st Ridout Road, right? When the tenant negotiated for the rent, the conditions was bad, so $23 per square meter. But after that, you put in 570,000 to upgrade the place, and you still charge at $23 per square meter, and that is a rent that is way below the lowest price of the range of prices in the vicinity. Do you think that is a fair price? And if your valuation agent provided that price, do you think the SLA officials should be there to say, no, it cannot be that price? Because throughout the discussion today, we also say that 26 Ridout Road, because of the improvement to the site that was being cleared, so I have increased the rental of 26 Ridout Road by $2,000. So, so the final rent, in fact, depends on this assessment, right? So why didn't SLA raise the objection to keep the price, the rental at $23 per square meter? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Leong, it is because there's a guide rent. The guide rent is determined by an independent valuer, and I would suggest not to second guess that. The whole point of appointing a managing agent with a valuer who looks at it independently is so that we can get an assessment, a baseline. And if indeed there is a basis to push the rent up, the guide rent up, in a way in which is market standard and coheres with the market, of course we will do so. But this is a guide rent, and we follow the guide rent. And as I said earlier in my speech, we don't let properties out below the guide rent. So I hope that answers your question.
Minister Shanmugam.
I thought I should answer one point that Mr. Leong made, suggesting that there was a coincidence on 26,500. If I heard him right, there's no coincidence. I think he may have missed the facts when they were being set out. Thank you. I explained. I didn't know what the guide rent was. It is set out in the CPIB report. And there is no coincidence in the way he suggested on 26,500. I also set out what was the first offer I made.
Mr. Leong, just
Sir,
a short, if it
I-
arises from Minister Shanmugam's
Yes. I think what the
response.
I think what the
Hold on.
minister.
If it arises from Minister Shanmugam's response, you may proceed to ask a short clarification.
Can I? Thank you. Yeah, I like to clarify with the minister that I didn't say the coincidence is with regards to the 26, with regards to his 26,500 rent. Okay, so your point is not valid there. Yeah, thanks.